In the middle of the 19th century, somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, there was a lonely cabin. There is not a soul around, only harsh peaks covered with snow. A 6-month death sentence, not handed down by a court, but by nature. No heating bills, no shops, no ambulance, only silence broken by the howling wind. If you are not prepared for the onset of winter, it will decide your fate. In December, the temperature can drop below -40, and by January, the hut will be buried under 4.5 meters of snow. It's days of travel to the nearest settlement. In the spring, there may not even be a trace of it under the snow. What forgotten techniques allowed these people to survive in such conditions? Watch until the end to find out how knowledge and instincts help them not only survive, but also adapt to their most brutal enemy, nature. In the harsh winter conditions of the Rocky Mountains, the main source of heat was a wood-burning stove, which was called a bourgeoise in the settlements. At first glance, its design seems primitive, a steel box with a door and a chimney. However, without proper installation and operation, it could become a deadly trap. From the outside, the stove seemed like a lifesaver, but inside it was a threat. The carbon monoxide emitted during combustion could quietly and imperceptibly poison a sleeping person. To avoid this, the mountain dwellers installed a complex ventilation system in their huts. They made small holes in the walls under the ceiling so that fresh air could enter the room and then exit through the chimney. This system allowed air to circulate and prevented it from stagnating. In addition, the stove required constant attention. A dying fire at night could cause the temperature inside the hut to drop to 0. To avoid this, the mountain dwellers developed a special technique. They used large logs that burned slowly, maintaining the heat throughout the night. They also placed large stones on the floor near the stove, which heated up during the day and gave off heat at night. But it wasn't just the right setup and constant attention to the fire that were key to survival. The mountain people also came up with unique ways to save wood. They didn't just chop down trees, but collected dry branches that had already fallen. This not only helped preserve the forest, but also made the fire burn more efficiently, as dry wood gave off more heat and less smoke. In addition, they used ash. Instead of throwing it away, they mixed it with clay and water to make a solution that was used to seal cracks in the walls of their huts. This solution not only improved insulation, but also prevented drafts that could extinguish the fire or cause heat to escape. Thanks to these simple but effective methods, the mountain dwellers were able to turn the bourgeois from a dangerous toy into a reliable helper that guaranteed warmth and safety even in the most severe cold. Heat or safety, what are you willing to sacrifice for another night? Tell us about your scariest story involving a wood-burning stove in the comments. Despite the presence of a stove, it was almost impossible to maintain a constant temperature. Therefore, the mountain dwellers used geothermal heating. They built their huts close to the rocks, or even on the slopes of the mountains, to use the heat of the earth. They dug deep pits under the floor and filled them with stones, which heated up during the day and gave off heat at night. This helped maintain a stable temperature inside the hut. But what did they do when there were no rocks or caves nearby? They dug dugouts. These were semi-underground huts with one wall built against a hill and the others made of logs. Dugouts were very effective because the earth was a good insulator. But they were also dangerous. Deep pits could collapse. Building dugouts required a careful approach and a deep knowledge of soil properties. The mountain dwellers determined the type of soil to ensure that it was dense enough and would not crumble under pressure. They reinforced the walls with logs and branches, creating a frame that prevented collapses. In addition, they always made the entrance at an angle to minimize the entry of cold air. This simple but effective method allowed them to retain heat and save energy. They did not have to constantly heat the room. Another important aspect was the use of vegetation. Mountain dwellers often built dugouts near bushes or trees, which provided additional protection from wind and snow. The roots of the plants held the soil in place, preventing erosion, while the branches created a natural barrier that trapped heat. These seemingly simple tricks were the result of years of observation and experience. Every detail mattered. From the choice of location to the last log, everything was geared toward survival. Can technologies created to save lives become the cause of death? We'll talk about that next. In isolation, meat was their main source of food. But how could they preserve it without refrigerators? The mountain dwellers used a special technique that allowed them to store meat for several months. They did this with salt and spices, But that's not all. They also used pH. They understood that bacteria cannot grow in an acidic environment, so they used vinegar to marinate the meat. This not only preserved it, but also made it tastier. They also used herbs that contain tannins to preserve the meat. This technique allowed them to store meat for several months. In addition, they made jerky from meat. They cut the meat into thin slices and dried it in the sun or over a fire. This not only preserved the meat, but also made it more nutritious. They also added spices to the jerky to give it flavor. This technique allowed them to store meat for several months. But the most amazing thing was their knowledge of fermentation. They used the fermentation process to preserve meat. They dug pits in the ground, lined them with stones, then laid the meat in them and covered it with branches and leaves. In this environment, bacteria that are harmless to humans began to multiply, creating an acidic environment that killed harmful microorganisms. This process allowed them to store meat for several months without it spoiling. They also used a method called hot salt preservation. They boiled large pieces of meat in a saturated salt solution and then hung them up to dry. The salt penetrated deep into the fibers, drawing out moisture and creating an unfavorable environment for bacteria. This method was especially effective for fatty meats. But that's not all. The mountain dwellers did not throw away any part of the animal. They boiled the bones and cartilage to make broth, which they then dried and turned into concentrated cubes. These broth cubes could be stored for years, and when needed, simply dissolved in hot water. This method allowed them to obtain nutritious soup even in the hungriest times. All this knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. These techniques may seem simple, but they allowed the mountain dwellers not only to survive, but also to thrive. In isolation, any wound could be fatal. There were no doctors or antibiotics. How did they treat deep wounds when the nearest doctor was 800 kilometers away? First and foremost, the mountain dwellers turned to nature, which was their only pharmacy. They used pine bark to make decoctions for washing wounds. This bark is rich in tannins, substances with astringent and antiseptic properties that helped clean the wound and speed up healing. In addition, they applied plantain leaves to cuts. It contains natural antibacterial substances that help stop bleeding and prevent infection. These simple but effective methods were the basis of their survival. However, their arsenal of remedies was not limited to herbs and bark. Local residents actively used the resin of coniferous trees, which also had powerful antiseptic properties. It was heated and applied to the wound to create a protective barrier against bacteria and stop the bleeding. The resin served not only as a disinfectant, but also as a kind of natural glue, pulling the edges of the wound together and promoting rapid closure. One of the most valuable and versatile remedies was honey. It was widely used not only as food, but also as a powerful medicine. Honey is a natural antiseptic due to its high sugar content and low moisture content, which creates an unfavorable environment for bacteria to grow. Mountain dwellers applied it to wounds to protect them from infection and also used it to treat coughs and colds. Honey was a real lifesaver when conventional medicines were unavailable and helped people survive where others could not. The use of these simple but effective natural remedies shows how, in harsh conditions, people were forced to become true survival experts. Without doctors or pharmacies, they had to be herbalists and healers. But how did they even find their way home if moss on trees could heal a cut, but couldn't tell them where to go? Keep watching this video to find out the answer to that question. How can you avoid getting lost in the mountains without GPS or maps? Mountain dwellers used natural landmarks to help them find their way even in the harshest conditions. They navigated by the sun, stars, moss, and rivers. Their knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, becoming a kind of living map of the area. In clear weather, the sun was the main landmark. They knew that it always rises in the east and sets in the west, and this simple rule allowed them to determine the cardinal directions. At night, the stars served as landmarks. The mountain dwellers were well versed in the constellations and knew that the North Star was always in the north. This helped them stay on track even in the dark when all other landmarks were hidden. However, what to do when the sky is overcast and neither the sun nor the stars are visible? In such cases, other equally reliable signs were used. They paid attention to moss, which usually grows on the north side of trees, protected from direct sunlight. This simple observation helped to determine the direction when other methods did not work. They also followed rivers and streams. Knowing that water always flows downhill, they could determine whether they were descending or ascending and find a valley where there might be settlements or trails. In addition, the mountain dwellers read the land itself. They memorized the contours of the mountains, the curves of the ridges, and the location of the gorges. They could determine direction by the shape of the rocks, the characteristics of the vegetation on the slopes, and even by the direction of the wind. It was not just knowledge, it was a feeling for the land that allowed them to navigate intuitively, even without visible landmarks. In their world, every rock, every tree, and every stream was part of one big system that helped them survive and not get lost in the vast uninhabited spaces. Loneliness was the mountain dwellers' worst enemy. The lack of communication, monotonous daily life, and constant fear of the wild and the unknown could drive them mad. In complete isolation, with no one to lean on, they found ways to preserve their sanity and inner harmony. One of the key tools for maintaining mental health was routine, a daily repetitive cycle of activities. Gathering firewood, hunting, cooking, created a sense of stability and order. This orderly life helped them focus on survival and kept their thoughts from wandering into anxiety and despair. Each completed task became a small victory, strengthening their confidence in their abilities. In addition to their routine, the mountain dwellers turned to creativity. They found an outlet for their emotions by carving decorations out of bones, painting cave walls, or making simple musical instruments. These activities not only helped pass the time, but also allowed them to express their inner feelings, fears, and hopes. Their inner world was reflected in every line and every pattern, serving as a kind of therapy that allowed them to stay connected to themselves and reality. But even when routine and creativity did not have the desired effect, faith remained. The mountain dwellers believed in the power of higher forces that were always there, supporting their spirit. Prayer gave them hope and strength to survive. It became a personal dialogue with the world, a way to find comfort and feel that they were not alone. This faith was the last bastion, helping them overcome the darkest moments of despair. If faith, firewood, and creativity helped them stay sane, how did they chop that firewood and paint their masterpieces when the nearest store was a week's journey away? We'll tell you all about it soon. The mountain dwellers had no shops where they could buy everything they needed to survive. In conditions of complete autonomy, their main advantage was their ability to turn raw, natural materials into essential items. They were true craftsmen, creating clothes, tools, dishes, and weapons from literally whatever they found under their feet. Clothes were sewn from the skins of animals such as deer, goats, or wolves. The skins were not simply dried, but carefully processed to make them soft and durable. First, they were cleaned of fat and meat, then kneaded and stretched, and sometimes tanned using tanning agents from oak bark or other plants. The skins were sewn together with tendons taken from the same animals. Leather was used to make shoes, sturdy sandals or moccasins that protected the feet on rocky trails. Each item was created with the harsh climate in mind, providing maximum protection from the cold and wind. Tableware was made from clay. The mountain dwellers found suitable clay in riverbeds or on mountain slopes. It was cleaned of impurities, kneaded, and shaped into pots, bowls, and jugs. These items were then fired over an open fire to make them hard and waterproof. This provided them with reliable containers for storing water and cooking food, which lasted for years. Tools and weapons were made from stone, bone, and wood. It was a whole arsenal, from primitive knives to complex throwing weapons. Flint or obsidian was used to make knives, spearheads, and arrowheads. These stones were split into sharp plates using other, harder stones to achieve a perfect cutting edge. The bones of large animals were used as needles for sewing, awls for working leather, and hooks for fishing. Wood was perhaps the most versatile material. It was used to make tool handles, frames for dwellings, bows and arrows. Flexible and durable branches, such as ash or yew, were selected to make bows, and the bowstring was made from tendons or plant fibers. Arrows were carved from straight branches and balanced by attaching feathers from birds. All this required a deep knowledge of the properties of materials, as well as incredible patience and skill. The mountain dwellers did not just survive, they created a culture based on harmony with nature. Every object they created was not only functional, but also reflected their respect for the world around them. They knew where to find the best clay, how to treat hides so they wouldn't rot, and which stone was perfect for making sharp blades. This was their main advantage, complete independence and self-sufficiency, which allowed them to survive in conditions where others could not. For the mountain dwellers, fire was not just a source of heat, but the very heart of their existence. It provided warmth on cold nights, illuminated the darkness, protected them from wild animals, and allowed them to cook food. Fire was a symbol of life and safety, and therefore the ability to make it was one of the most important survival skills. Mountain dwellers mastered the art of making fire using the most primitive but reliable methods. The most common method was to use flint and pyrite, or another hard stone containing iron. They struck one stone against another with force, striking sparks that then fell onto prepared tinder, dry moss, grass, wood dust, or tinder fungus. This process required incredible skill, patience, and precision, as the slightest mistake could cause the spark to go out without igniting the dry material. But what did they do when there was no flint? They used the friction method. One of the most well-known methods is the fire drill. It was based on the principle of quickly rubbing one piece of wood against another. To do this, they took a piece of soft wood, such as cedar or pine, and made a small depression in it. Then, using a stick that was quickly rotated between the palms, friction was created. As the speed of rotation and pressure increased, wood dust formed in the recess, which began to smolder from the heat. This smoldering dust was transferred to tinder and carefully blown on until it burst into flames. Fire was vital not only for heating, it was the main tool for cooking. Under the influence of heat, raw meat or plants became more edible, and most importantly, fire killed bacteria and parasites that could cause serious diseases. Cooked food was also easier for the body to digest, which was critically important in conditions of constant food shortages. In addition to domestic use, fire served another important purpose: protection from predators. The roaring flames and crackling of the fire scared away wolves, bears, and other dangerous animals that were afraid of light and fire. This allowed the mountain dwellers to sleep peacefully without fear of attack. The campfire was also a kind of beacon that helped people find their way in the dark and signal their presence to others. In their world, fire was not just a resource. It was a living companion that gave a sense of security and hope. Fire was also a central element of their social life and culture. People gathered around the fire to share food, tell stories, and simply feel a sense of community. It symbolized the hearth, family, and community. In this unity, they found the strength to overcome all the difficulties of isolation. Fire was not just a tool for them. It was a link between man and the world, between the past and the future, and was a source of life in the truest sense of the word. The mountain dwellers were not just survivors. They were true predators at the top of the food chain in their ecosystem. They skillfully hunted large animals such as bears, moose, and deer, providing themselves with food, clothing, and materials for tools. Their main weapons were bows, arrows, and spears, which they made themselves from wood and stone. Bows required special skill. They were made from flexible but strong types of wood, and the bowstrings were made from animal tendons. Each arrow was carefully carved and fitted with a sharp stone tip. Spears with heavy tips were used for close combat and to finish off wounded prey. In addition to direct confrontation, the mountain dwellers used traps and snares. They knew the habits of animals and could predict their paths. Traps were made from branches and stones, for example. Pit traps were dug, loops were made from vines, or falling stone barriers were created. These methods allowed them to obtain food with minimal risk to their own lives. The ability to read tracks, understand animal behavior, and create effective traps made them not just hunters, but intelligent and patient strategists. In the harsh mountain winter, where temperatures could drop to extremely low levels, the mountain dwellers developed unique survival strategies. Although they did not go into full hibernation like animals, their lives slowed down to conserve vital energy and resources. They built deep dugouts that served as reliable shelters from the biting cold and wind. These dwellings, dug into the ground, took advantage of the soil's insulating properties, which helped maintain a relatively stable and comfortable temperature inside. They also stored large supplies of food, such as dried meat, dried fruit, and roots, which provided them with sustenance for many months. During the winter, the mountain dwellers minimized physical activity. They spent most of their time in their dugouts, conserving the energy that would have been spent fighting the cold. Their sleep patterns became longer. interrupted only by meals and the most essential needs. This conscious reduction in activity was key to their survival, allowing them to use their stored supplies efficiently and wait for spring. We have seen that survival in the Rocky Mountains in the 19th century was not just survival, but a true art form. The mountain dwellers were not just people who were lucky enough to survive, but true masters of their craft. Their skills, from finding natural antiseptics and navigating by the stars to creating tools from stone and maintaining psychological stability in isolation, made them intelligent, strong, and resilient heroes. Their story is not just a chronicle of hardship, but an inspiring example of how people, relying on themselves and nature, can overcome any obstacle. Their experience shows that true strength lies not in technology, but in knowledge, patience, and the ability to adapt. They have proven that even in the harshest conditions, it is possible not only to survive, but to thrive, creating your own world from what nature provides. What else would you like to know about the lives of migrants in the past? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new videos.